May I share the screen? Or?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, let's go.
No, we're in direct. Okay. Well, thank you. So maybe we can start now. So it's a pleasure. Yeah, we can see all your screen. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and to host Sebastián Sánchez. So it's a bit of a shame we were supposed to have a first real seminar in presential, but unfortunately with the situation, we have to do that online. So Sebastián Sánchez is from Spain, and now he is in Mexico at UNAM. So he did his license and studies in the Universidad de Salamanca, and then he had his PhD in la Universidad de Cantabria. During his PhD, he was traveling and working at the Observatory de La Palma, and then he moved to Madrid as an administrator of systems. He had a Marie Curie at the Instituto de Astrophysica Institute of Potsdam in Germany, and then he went back in Spain for different positions in Aragon and in Andalusia. And since 2013, he moved in Mexico, where he is working at the Instituto de Astronomía de la Universidad Autónoma de México. And during his careers, he was working on many projects, and he was, for example, principal investigator of the Khalifa project, and he is one of the foundator of the project Sami on Manga, and now he's the leader of the project called Local Volume Mapper at UNAM. So today is going to speak about how we can explore the properties of low-redshift galaxies with integral field spectroscopy. So Sebastián, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to me to be here in the Canary Islands and at the IEC. And I want to thank the IEC and the Fundación Jesús Serra for allowing me to be here for this short but very interesting period. So I'm going to make a summary of the research of many people. Some of them are even in the audience. That comprise the explorations that have been done in the last 10 years about the spatial result properties of galaxies in the nearby universe. We summarize these results in two reviews that we published along this, well, they were finally published along this year. Well, that is a reference that is wrong, obviously. The first is in the Annual Review of Astronomy and Astrophysics, and the second is the Revista Mexicana of Astronomy and Astrophysics. But you can find these results in many other articles. These two articles are just a compendium of what has been explored in the last years. They are mostly based on integral field spectroscopy. For the newer in the audience, integral field spectroscopy is a technique that allows to obtain simultaneously several continuous or more continuous spectra of a field in the sky. And after a lot of coding and processing, the final data after reduction consists either in a spatially continuous distribution of spectra in a 3D cube, where you have X, Y, and lambda, or a set of individual spectra arranged in certain positions in the sky when the field of view is not covered completely. There are several techniques that allows you to obtain this kind of data. I'm not going to enter into detail. It's a technique that has been a while around. It's not a very new technique. Indeed, it has nearly 30 years or a bit more. However, it has been in the last 10 to 15 years that it has been exploited, in particular in the exploration of galaxies. These are some IFUs that you can find here in Spain. We still have PIMAS in Colorado, WAVE, and William Herschel when it's fully operational, and Megara is working in JTC. There is several issues at ISO, new and old, and the ISO has made a big move to IFUs, and the biggest one and the most productive one so far is Muse, that is like the jewel of the crown somehow. No? For long years, integral field spectroscopy was a technique that was applied to a few number of galaxies, a handful of them. The outcoming of integral field spectroscopy galaxy surveys has been has made the proper combination of this marvelous technique that allows you to have a panoramic view of the spectroscopic properties of galaxies, combined with a large and statistically significant sample of galaxies. And integral field galaxy surveys is what we're going to talk about along this technique. For a study to become an integral field spectroscopy galaxy survey, obviously it has to use integral field spectroscopy. It has to cover a large fraction of the optical extension of each galaxy, as much as possible. It should cover large and representative sample of galaxies. It should be able to explore the stellar population and ionized gas content in these galaxies and provide information and dynamics. Basically, a panoramic full view of the optical properties, spectroscopic optical properties of these galaxies, with a sample large enough to make a statistical analysis. There are several of these surveys that I'm going to talk about, and one problem to overcome is the huge amount of data that these surveys provide. So to digest them has been developed several pipelines that automatically or semi-automatically analyze the data. I'm going to talk about the results with Pi3D. It's a pipeline that we have developed in our group, and but there are other ones, and I list some of them below. Most of these surveys, and many of the people that knows me have seen this plot so many times. Most of the surveys observe the galaxies in a different way, and when you compare them, you have to take care about how this observation has been taken. I'm not going to enter into details in here. I'm just plotting a summary of how is covered the field of view and the spatial resolution that usually is achieved with the different surveys. And here in the bottom, I summarize the Welland range covered by them, just to highlight the fact that when you combine or you compare results from different surveys, you have to be aware of the differences. And there are surveys that make a lot of emphasis in the number of galaxies, like for example, MANGA. Other surveys like CALIFA cover a lower number of galaxies, but cover the galaxies in a better spatial resolution and optical extension. And the combination of the different capabilities of the different surveys provide with a different kind of information that has to be compared with care before driving severe conclusions. What I did in these two articles of a review of the results was to make a compilation of all the data that were publicly available at the time for integral field spectroscopy galaxy surveys. The situation has not changed that much from when I did these reviews and now. There are a bit more data that has been delivered publicly for the SAMI survey, for example, and there are more data that can be compiled looking in the archive of ISO for Muse. But in general, until the end of this year, when MANGA delivered the final data release, the number of publicly accessible data of fulfilling these characteristics that I outlined before is of the order of the 8,000 to 9,000 galaxies. We restrict the presentation here to galaxies in the nearby universe. That means around 100 to a few hundred megaparsecs of distance, a redshift around 0.02, We made a compilation based on Manga, Khalifa, Muse, and SADMI public data. Of them, as I said before, not all the surveys, these are the distributions in the color magnitude diagram and the site magnitude diagram and the receive magnitude diagrams for the compilation we did at that time. The color code correspond to the density in these density images, and the contours correspond to a subset that we name the well-resolved sample. When I talk about resolved properties, I will restrict from these 8,000 galaxies to those that are clearly well-resolved. That means that the effective radii is at least 2 times the fully flat maximum of the PSF of the data, and you can sample up to 2.5 effective radii. And this limits a lot the linear sample, and we have a subset of 1,500 galaxies. To homogenize the analysis and compare the results between the different data, we analyzed all of them with Py3D. That it's one of these pipelines. I'm going to summarize very briefly how it works. And we homogenize the resolution and the sampling difference on the different data. That basically means degrading the resolution of the Muse data somehow to match that of the other surveys that have obviously a worst resolution. So details are provided in the different articles I said you before. How this Py3D pipeline works, I'm going to be very fast in here. It's an automatic pipeline that basically take one of these data cubes, and it performs a first analysis on the central spectra, the spectra with the highest signal to noise, to provide a guess of the systemic velocity, the velocity dispersion, and the range of parameters that are going to be analyzed. Then it performs a broadband filtering to derive the signal to noise in different positions. You need more or less to homogenize the signal to noise to provide similar results at different radial locations. For doing that, we make a spatial binning. So the information provided at different locations may change the spatial resolution in the case of stellar populations. We combine the spectra in different bins, and then we analyze them, decoupling the emission lines from the stellar population content. The stellar population content is fit with a set of single stellar population spectra, synthetic stellar population spectra. And this way we derive the star formation history, the chemical enrichment, and in general, the main properties of the stellar populations. Once you have that model for the stellar population, we subtract that model and we provide with a cube where all the contribution from the stellar component is removed. So you have basically the emission lines plus noise, and on them we make an analysis to derive the properties of the emission lines. So the kind of information you can derive for the stellar population is what we name an archaeological approach. We model the spectra to recover the star formation and chemical enrichment histories. This is a typical fitting with the basic code we use. And in here we see the weights, basically the fraction of light in the certain band, divided, split in the different ECCPs for different ages. So this is it will be the age distribution function, and in here you have different metallicities. So in here you have the metallicity distribution function that you can derive from this analysis. And of course, you can collapse these two axes and derive the average age and the average metallicity, weighted luminosity or weighted mass, but that's just the average of both distributions. The technique is known for long ago. I mean, it was described in the 70s and 80s by Tinsley and reviewed by Conroy and Balher more recently. Once you have all this decoupling, you may derive these average properties for each spectrum. So you have a two-dimensional distribution of those properties, the light distribution, the age distribution, the metallicity distribution, and the Das attenuation distribution. But you have also, since you have the weight at different ages, you have the weighted mass at different ages. So you have a two-dimensional distribution of how the mass is grown in these galaxies at different locations. So you can explore the inside out or outside in growth and so on. Other product that you derive from here, it's the gas content. So for each emission line, you can derive the flux intensity, the velocity dispersion, the equivalent width. Again, spatial result, and therefore this can help you to explore how the ionization changes in different locations within a galaxy. I'm making a brief summary of that. If you have more questions, we can go later on details. Most of the pipelines that analyze this kind of data work in the different phases of this kind of sequence. So I'm not going to enter more deeply on that. So once you have all these informations for the different galaxies, is when you can start to explore what's happening with the galaxies. No? So first, I'm going to make a brief summary of what are the global properties that we know of these galaxies. Some of them, many of them were known before the outcome of integral field spectroscopy galaxy surveys. So in the case of ionization, before the outcome of these surveys, most of the information that we derived from the analysis of single aperture spectroscopic data, like for example, slow iron or gamma. So this is the kind of distribution you can find using the, I did that distribution with the compilation that I described before, but similar distributions can be reproduced if you use slow iron data or gamma data. In here, you see the location in the BPT diagram, the classical oxygen to nitrogen BPT diagram for individual galaxies. So it's pointing here where there are density points, but it's pointing here correspond to a galaxy. So this is treating a galaxy like an unresolved entity. And distributions in here are for all the galaxies in the compilation I did. In the x-axis is the distribution segregated by morphology, and in the y-axis the distribution segregated by mass. So this, so in this diagonal, these are the more later type galaxies and less massive, and these are the more early type and more massive galaxies. And as you can see, there is a clear connection between the morphology and the mass of galaxies and the kind of ionizations that is dominating here. Color code is the equivalent width of H alpha. So when you have star-forming galaxies like SCs, SD galaxies, those the ionization here is dominated by young stars in general, that they follow the classical track of H2 regions. The equivalent width is high. On the contrary, for early type and less massive galaxies, you have a combination of different ionizations, and some of the ionizations you can see here correspond to low equivalent widths, and they are in the linear-like region of the ionization. You may find some blue points just in this location, well above. These are the Kaufman and Cooley demarcation lines that are broadly misinterpreted in literature. I will go back to that later. These points with high blue colors, high equivalent width of H alpha, and above the Cooley and Kaufman curves are most probably objects dominated by the ionization of AGNs. And in here, you have all these linear-like to intermediate or mixed ionization and ionization even below the Cooley and the Kaufman curve with low equivalent width in galaxies that are usually, they don't present too much star formation, or they don't present a star formation at all. And the people get surprised when I show this plot. I will show you another plot that is even more intriguing for many people. because now in textbooks you can find that these demarcation lines can be used to separate ionization clearly from these PPT diagrams. And the people say that everything that is below, at least the Kaufman curve and generally even the Keeley curve, it has to be associated with ionization due to young stars. I mean, basically related to star formation, and everything that is above has to be an AGN, or now it's more frequently also consider the fact that there are homes and post-AGV ionization and other kind of ionization that comes in here. But these lines are broadly misinterpreted. If you go to the articles where these curves are described, in the case of the Kaufman curve, in the Kaufman 2003, what they said was that they have painted by eye, basically, the envelope of the classical loci of H2 regions that is tracing what they consider star-forming galaxies. So go to the article, it's more or less describing these words. So what they did basically is to trace the envelope that correspond to those galaxies in here. And indeed, this envelope matched pretty well with that curve as it was described. In the case of the Keeley curve, it's an upper limit. Keeley described it as the maximum line ratios that you can get from photoionization models when the ionization comes from young stars under certain assumptions on these photoionization models. So this is a maximum curve that basically says that nothing above that can be ionized by young stars. And there are some caveats even in that claim. But she said nothing, or they said nothing about what's happening below that. And below that could be star formation, I mean, ionization due to young stars, or anything. So they never claimed that everything below that was directly associated with ionization by star formation. And that's a problem that we have to live with that. Okay, so this is the connection between morphology, mass, the kind of stellar populations that are residing in these galaxies, and the kind of ionization is obviously highlighting this kind of plot, but it's not showing all the picture. We know that galaxies in the local universe are bimodal, and they have been bimodal for at least the last 8 gigayears. So we have, and this is the H stellar mass distribution. Again, 1 point here corresponds to one galaxy. We're still treating galaxies as single points. And early type galaxies are dominated by a stellar population that in general is older than late type galaxies. This is well known. And there is not a clear continuity here, at least in the luminosity weighted age. And we have two very well defined red sequence and a blue cloud. This is the equivalent to the classical color magnitude diagram. So nothing surprising in here. Again, the color code is equivalent with of H alpha. I'm going to use that through all the presentation. And this is, again, highlighting the direct connection between the stellar population, the kind of underlying stellar population you find in galaxies, and the kind of ionizations you find in there. So galaxies that are dominated by young stellar populations have ionization associated with this location in the BPT diagram. Galaxies that have this kind of intermix or mixed populations, then they spread at different locations in the BPT diagram. This bimodality is even more clearly seen in this other diagram, where we see the star formation rate versus the stellar mass. And in here, you see two clear trends, one for the star-forming galaxies, that they actually form, of course, they correspond to late-type galaxies. They follow a very nice and tight relation, power-law relation between these two quantities. In the case of galaxies that they don't form stars, they are following some kind of a cloud or another sequence just below, and in between you can clearly see a valley. No, it's the so-called green valley between the star-forming galaxies and the retired cloud. And curiously, there's some white points. Maybe you'll see them very well. This is the location of the optically selected AGNs. Apparently, optically selected AGNs are in transition. The host galaxies of optically selected AGNs are in transition between star-forming and retired galaxies, and that's a kind of a indirect evidence of the connection between the activation of an AGN and the quenching of the star formation. Again, this is known, and here are the reference for some time ago. More recently, there were some explorations on why galaxies halt this star formation. What is the major driver? If it's a question of efficiency or is a question of lack of gas. If it is a question of a lack of gas, which kind of gas is missing? If it's atomic or molecular gas. And at least for molecular gas, we know that those galaxies that are not actually forming stars have a much lower fraction of molecular gas for their stellar mass content. So this diagram is the diagram that relates the molecular gas derived using two proxies based on the dust attenuations for the ionized gas and for the stellar population against the stellar mass. For star-forming galaxies, these two quantities again follow a power law that is known as the molecular gas main sequence. And galaxies that don't present a strong star formation, they are well below. So it seems that the lack of molecular gas is the primary driver for quenching or for the lack of star formation. However, efficiency also plays a role. So if we represent the star formation rate versus the molecular gas mass, we have again a sequence that is an integrated version of the Kenikant-Smith law for star-forming galaxies. And if you look in detail, this is the best fit to that line. When we show that line at the galaxies that are partially quenched and galaxies that are totally quenched, the star formation efficiency drops also. So lack of molecular gas is a primary driver, but there is also a chain of the star formation efficiency integrated through galaxies. I mean, that's an important thing to mention here. We are talking about integrated quantities so far. The other relation that emerged in galaxies is the relation between the oxygen abundance and the stellar mass. This has been known from the 80s in general, but it has been conceptually analyzed in more detail after the results by Tremonti et al. 2004, where they used the Sloan to characterize this relation pretty well. We know that that relation depends strongly on the calibrator. I put here two examples of the calibration, how the shape of this relation changed and how with morphology also changed. And of course, in the case of early type S0s, the fraction of regions, the fraction of galaxies that still form stars is low, so a statistic is poor here. But in general, this relation has a linear trend for low mass and then some kind of asymptotic value at high mass. And then later we can discuss if there is our secondary relations and so on if you want, but this is basically the main relations that emerge from the exploration of galaxies as single points. However, galaxies are resolved entities, as we all know, and that was one of the primary reasons why galaxies were explored 100 years ago. Most of the processes that happens in galaxies, star formation, the ionization, the metal enrichment, are local processes and not global ones. And for individual galaxies, this is kind of a Hubble sequence that extracted from Muse data. In the top panels, I'm showing the contour 3D color maps. In the bottom panels, I show the color maps generated from the emission line intensities, where oxygen 3 is blue, H alpha is in green, and nitrogen 2 is in red. So this brownish distribution says the nitrogen is higher than the other two lines. Green means that the H alpha is stronger than the other two. And when you have these bluish colors, and then the oxygen is rising up. So this is some kind of a BPT diagram just shown in a spatially resolved. And in here, you can see that all these regions, the greenish regions are star-forming regions in galaxies, the classical H2 regions. In galaxies like this SD, you can see the gradient of the abundance just because there is a color change. The more greenish in the center, more bluish in the outer part. In this SC also you can see that this is more greenish and this is more bluer, and this is talking about the abundance gradient in these galaxies. But more interestingly, you see that the ionization obviously is something that is local. The ionization associated with the star formation happens on scales much lower than a galaxy scale. The typical scale is the scale of an H2 region or H2 cluster or a molecular cloud. And in particular, in this kind of intermediate galaxies, you may find star formation in the outer part, but you may find other kind of ionizations in the central part. In this galaxy, you have shock ionization, most probably, these filamentary lines here, even ionization due to the AGN ionization associated with the jet. This is M87, so the famous, it was famous before in any case, AGN, but has been more famous now. Was more famous before by the jet. Now it's more famous by the Horizon event experiment. And all these ionizations cannot be explained easily if you just integrate those quantities. So we need to explore that spatial result if we want to get some more generic view for what's going on with the properties of galaxies and with ionizations in particular. For that, we need integral field spectroscopy, but as I said before, you have to take a lot of care when you compare data from the different integral field spectroscopy surveys. This is an example of a galaxy observed with MANGA, with the largest bundle. MANGA have observed the galaxies with different bundles. This is the largest bundle, and this is the same galaxy. There's not a simulation, there are just the data. And this is the Sloan image in here. This is the three-color continuous image, and this is the same kind of image I showed you before for the emission lines. If you derive a global or spatial result properties of this galaxy using this kind of data, you are missing all the external part, and most of the, for instance, most of the abundance gradient that you clearly see here, the chain of greenish to bluish from the center to the outer part, is totally missing in the case of this data. So resolution and sampling is very important. If you compare with SAMI, you may have the same effect. This is how SAMI see a galaxy. You still see some brownish ionization here, that it's a liner-like ionization. This is how it's seen with Khalifa. Of course, if you compare Khalifa with Muse, you have the contrary effect. This is the kind of information you derive with Muse, and this is the kind of information you derive with Khalifa. And in here, you see this pinky or brownish ionization in the very center that is almost unseen. If you look in detail, it's still there, but almost unseen in the case of the Khalifa data. And the distinction between the different clumps associated with the star formation is totally blur or partially blur in the Khalifa data, and it's more evident in Muse. So take a lot of care when you make these kind of comparisons. So I'm going to jump now to the result properties of galaxies, first making emphasis on the ionization gas. Ionized gas. First, take a lot of care when you derive conclusions from integrated or single aperture data. I'm going to show you some examples of what may happen. These are Muse data, and here you have again the continuous image and the three-color image. And you see here, for example, this is a galaxy from the I'm using sample that is a survey on supernova hosts. And this point in here is a supernova remnant that is located in the BPT. This image in here is a BPT diagram where each point in here is mapping each point in the emission lines. So the colors correspond to the colors in this emission line image. So all these green points here are located within the sequence, the classical sequence of H2 regions as expected. But then you see some white colors in here that correspond to this point. This is a supernova remnant. If you see this image or you integrate that, you may think that this galaxy hosts an AGN, when indeed it does not host an AGN at all. An AGN looks like that. Spatial resolve is much more clear. You see again a white color, and this white color is associated with this clamping here. And if you zoom these two things, you may have a point somehow in the intermediate or above the Kulik curve, and you may think that the two galaxies host an AGN, and it's not the case at all. The presence of ionization due to all the stars, it's something that was uncovered in the 90s by Binet and collaborators, and it has been discussed later on by Stasinska and Christophe Morisset has been working on that too. Flores Fajardo, 2011. And so the regions where you have all stellar populations in the central part of galaxies, you may have a diffuse ionization, and that the diffuse ionization may be related to the presence of Holmes, and is located well above the Kulik curve, but the equivalent width is much lower than what you expect from an AGN. So just, again, if you just use the BPT diagram and integrate the quantities, you may end up with a wrong conclusion. This Posey-GB's or Holmes ionization is more evident in galaxies where you don't see any trace of a star formation at all. So there is no clamps of a star formation here. And as you can see, they are located mostly in the liner light, but they also go below this curve. And you can reproduce that with for the ionization model. There is nothing strange in that. So there are Holm ionization that can be located below these curves, because these curves never said anything about what is below. They said something of what is above or what cannot be above. You can feel the same region in the BPT diagrams by a totally different kind of ionization. Shock ionization has been present and described in early type galaxies. Peter was one of the supporters of that ionization. You see these filamentary lines in here. They don't follow the spatial distribution of the stars. It's totally decoupled from the spatial distribution of the stars, and most probably this is associated with some kind of inflow of gas or remnants of gas from the previous mergers. And this shock feel basically the same kind of location in the BPT diagram. So if you just explore the location in the BPT diagram without knowing the spatial distribution, you may end up in the total wrong conclusion. And you also can see the classical shocks associated with outflows. This is not a totally edge-on galaxy, but at this location you see there's a conical structure of pinky emission in here that is associated with this structure in here. And this is, if you analyze the velocity and the velocity distribution and the velocity dispersion, this is associated with an outflow, mostly due or more probably due to the presence of a strong star formation in the central regions, and they are located in the same or almost the same location of what you see here. So you don't have the conclusion of this exploration is that if you don't have the spatial resolved distribution of the ionization, just with the BPT diagrams and whatever number of BPT diagrams you do, and just with the help of the equivalent width of H alpha, or even knowing the properties of the underlying stellar population, it's not enough to drive a conclusion of what is ionizing the galaxies, and you may end up in severe problems of interpretation. However, in general, you still see patterns, no? So before I show you a pattern of the ionization coming from integrating the properties of galaxies, this is the ionization spatial resolve. So in here, each point corresponds to 1 kiloparsec scale in the galaxies, and we follow the same scheme. So in here we have the morphology, and here we have the stellar mass. And as you can see, the distribution are less narrower, or they're more distributed within the PPT diagram. It's not only an effect of signal to noise. It's also an effect that when you coadd things in a galaxy, you end up in a single point that is the average, so the distribution gets narrower. And here you can see, for example, the dots grows from the center to the outer part. So the central regions of galaxies are more dominated by this liner-like ionization that in general is associated with all stellar populations. And in the outer parts, you see ionization due to a star formation. And as you can see in here, in particular in here, this ionization due to all the stars have a low equivalent width, is associated with an all-stellar population, is not restricted just to a region above this classical cut. It's almost everywhere in the right hand of the PPT diagram. But the general patterns that we know from galaxies still hold. So later type and less massive galaxies are dominated by ionization due to star formation. Intermediate or earlier spirals have a central region where you have this ionization due to all the stars, and then you have this sequence of ionization due to young stars. And you also see the gradient. These trends in here correspond to the gradient in the abundance. Okay, so when you compare the integrated distributions with the spatial resolved ones, you see that the conclusions that you may drive are totally different. So there are points in here that correspond to a wide distribution in here. And you may say, well, why is the fact that the integrated, you see the point to be dominated by star formation when I see a spatial resolve and this is totally diluted? The reason is that very few points with a few star formation in an early type galaxy may dominate the ionization when you integrate that. When you look at the spatial resolve, there are very few points. So the density distribution is small out. Since they have a high equivalent width, coadding them makes them more dominant in the integrated properties. So you may drive a totally different picture from these two plots. You have to take a lot of care. So the star formation rate in these kind of galaxies, if it exists, is a remnant. It's a very little, as we have seen recently in a PSD that was presented here in the IC. The most of the ionization came from other sources. However, when you coadd, you are weighting by intensity, and the intensity is by equivalent width of H alpha. And therefore it's diluted, and you get an integrated value that comes here down. Okay, so I'm going to be very, very fast in my next presentation because I'm very slow and I have just covered the ionization part here. We end up with this kind of scheme just to propose a scheme of how to classify the ionization that I'm not going to describe in detail. Just to tell the people that in general, the things are more complicated than we have assumed before having spatial resolve properties of the galaxies. I'm going to jump into the scaling relations. As I showed you before, there were 4 main relations for star-forming galaxies that has been described integrated on those galaxies. This is the first one is the relation between the star formation rate and the stellar mass. And one of the things that has been uncovered by these Integral Field Spectroscopy galaxy surveys is that most of these relations have a contour part at the kiloparsec scales. And this local relation, in the case of the star formation main sequence, is the resolved star formation main sequence, that is a relation between the stellar mass density and the star formation rate density, that it's preferentially observed in galaxies that are forming stars, or in regions that are forming stars, whatever is the host galaxy. It's changed by morphology, and in general follow the same kind of trend that the integrated one. It's a power law between these two quantities. The same happened for the Smith-Chemical law, although the relation of the Smith-Chemical law was non-resolved before than integrated. And for the mass metallicity relation, we have a counterpart of the mass metallicity relation that is the relation between the oxygen abundance and the stellar mass surface density that for star-forming galaxies follow a very similar trend than the integrated one. And indeed, more recently, we have actually demonstrated that both relations are the global ones and the local ones are basically the same. The star formation main sequence, the Smith-Chemical law, the molecular gas main sequence, and the resolve mass metallicity relation. When you express the integrated quantities in an intensive form, not in an extensive one, using the average stellar mass densities and the stellar mass density, the star formation surface density, and the molecular gas surface density. Basically, you take the integrated quantities and you divide by the area. You end up exactly with the same distributions that you observe spatially resolved. What I'm showing here in colors, the image is the spatial resolved distribution. So 1 point in here corresponds to 1 kiloparsec scale in many different galaxies from the sample that I was presenting before. And in contours are the integrated version of those quantities. As you can see, there is a total agreement of the distributions. Even for the retired regions, you have the same distribution in the retired galaxies. So both relations are essentially the same. Okay, so you have very few time. For the stellar populations, we also can describe a bimodality spatially resolved. This was the bimodality observed integrated in galaxies. And if you represent the average luminosity weighted age at different locations within galaxies versus the stellar mass surface density, for early type galaxies, you are dominated by old stars. And in the case of more late type galaxies, you have younger and younger stars. And when you have galaxies that are old and young stars, they jump and they have these two sequences, what is a very good, well-defined sequence of old stars and a cloud of young stars. So the bimodality that is described integrated is also described as spatially resolved. And I'm going to overpass all this section because basically we don't have more time. So I will post that somewhere so that people can see the results. I just want to highlight two results in here. You can explore the radial gradients of all these properties that I was presenting in the beginning. The most interesting result that is coming out of that is that star formation seems the star formation history of these galaxies seems to indicate that they grow from the inside out, and the quenching, and that was known long before, but the quenching, the halting of the star formation also happens from the inside out. So in early type galaxies, if you represent the specific star formation rate at different radii, the drop of the star formation is more intense in the center part. If there is still some star formation, that star formation seems to be more important in the outer part, relatively more important. So in absolute terms, the star formation rate is still stronger in the central part, but relatively to the total mass density of these galaxies. So that's came from comparing this distribution. This is the star formation rate versus the radii, and this is the specific star formation rate versus the radii. And in the outer part, late type galaxies may reach a specific star formation rate similar to what you find in late type spirals. Is in the central part when the star formation drops, and this drop is again associated with a deficit of gas rather than with chaining deficiency. So the lack of gas is more relevant than the chaining efficiency for this halting of the star formation from the inside out. So I'm going to jump into conclusions because we are running out of time. I consider that integral field spectroscopy galaxy surveys has improved considerably our understanding of the physical processes that shape and configure how we see galaxies today. One of the most relevant results is that we have to change our perception on how to interpret the ionization processes in galaxies. The ionization is a local process, and we cannot summarize the evolution of a galaxy as this galaxy is a point, it's a spatial result. Star formation happens at a much smaller scales than the galaxy size. Most of the evolution of galaxies is ruled by resolved relations between the stellar mass density and different quantities. Those relations evolve and should evolve along time. The global relations emerge from these local ones, but the local ones are also influenced by global properties. So there is an intercombination between these two relations. Galaxies grow from the inside out in general, at least in the last 8 gigayears. And both the star formation history and the chemical arrangement history are sharper in the central part of galaxies. The galaxies in the central part have a more peak star formation history that peak earlier in the cosmic time. So that's the sense of the inside out growth. And this is totally connected with the chemical enrichment. Enrichment happens faster in the central part than in the outer part. And again, quenching happens also from the inside out. Just I jump over that plot. I think it's relevant to show. Sorry. In here, what we are seeing is how the metallicity changes along the loop at time for different stellar masses. Sorry that I jump back from my conclusions. And you can see that the low mass galaxies, actual low mass galaxies, and in the bottom you have the star formation history of that galaxies. They have a much flatter star formation history and a less sharp chemical enrichment. In the case of the more massive galaxies, the star formation rate declines from the center to the outer part. From the beginning, from the early times to the current times. So the star formation history is much sharper. They have a much stronger star formation rate in the past, and then there is a decline. And this produce a stronger evolution of the metallicity, reaching some kind of a plateau. However, when you explore, this is integrating the properties of galaxies, and this was known before since the Panther and collaborators. However, when you split that from the center to the outer part, is when you see this differential enrichment, and the central part is enriched faster than the outer part in galaxies, due to the fact that the central part also presents a sharper star formation history. So that's I write out in the conclusion, but I didn't show the plot. So that was all. I think it's I have consumed almost 1 hour. If you let me another hour, the people that knows me knows that I will speak for another hour on this topic. So I think it's time to stop before you get totally bored.
Well, thank you really much, Sebastián. It was really interesting. And I hope that we'll be able to have another meeting from you to speak from another hour. So is there any questions so far for Sebastián? So just raise your hand or unmute yourself. So yeah, Jorge.
Okay, Sebastián, thanks for the talk, and plenty of things to be discussed. So, but I want you to comment on something that you pass over quickly, which is this alternative way you have for the BPT to decide ionization. You told us that you know how to do it better, and could you expand on that?
Well, I mean, it's good that you mentioned in the way you mentioned. I think we can do better. I don't have the final answer. I mean, I don't think there is a definitive answer because I think we have oversimplified the problem a lot. If you go to the article, I outlined some kind of a sequence of what you should do to classify the ionization in galaxies up to a certain point, because there are things that we still don't physically even know what to produce the ionization, or if there is a single reason. So the first is that if you don't have spatial resolved information, the most you can say is that something is dominated by a star formation or dominated by an AGN as a candidate. Sorry, someone was calling here. As a level of candidates. So you can say this is it's a candidate to be dominated by a star formation. It's a candidate to be dominated by AGN. You may combine the line ratios, the several line ratios, with the equivalent width of H alpha. This helps somehow because it's telling you about the compatibility of the properties of the underlying stellar population with the properties of the observed ionized gas. It would be better if you have the composition of the stellar population, so you can see if the amount of young stars is compatible with the observed line ratios. Velocity dispersion also can help because it can tell you, or even better, the line of sight, the velocity distribution, because this can tell you if there are some asymmetries, if the ionization may be due to the presence of shocks. This is if it's unresolved. If it's resolved, then the first thing that you may know is that the resolution has a limit. So we cannot identify at this distance single cluster of young stars ionizing the gas. But if you have clumps like these ones, the blue points in here, you better separate these clumps that normally are located in the sequence of star forming with this diffuse. And the diffuse gas in the case of late type galaxies may have a totally different origin than the diffuse gas on galaxies that are more early types. In the case of early types, you may have a diffuse, and it's more or less located in the same location in the BPT diagram. This diffuse may be due to leaking and turbulence and things that are associated somehow with the star formation and with the feedback. In the case of ellipticals, you most probably have a smooth distribution and the low equivalent width of H alpha, and it's located anywhere in this region. Most probably it's due to the presence of all stars. But if you have filamentary structures like these ones, then with a high velocity dispersion, then most probably you have shocks. In the case of the AGNs, should be concentrated in the center somehow and should have a higher equivalent width of H alpha. If you have a bipolar outflow, then it's more easy. But in general, you don't see that when it's face on. And then you may have the total confusion that to me is an early spiral. So have a bulge with the presence of all stars, a disk with the presence of young stars. It may present an AGN, and if it presents shocks, then you are totally screwed because everything is mixed here. So you may say something about the star forming regions if you see the clumps. But for the diffuse, most probably you have a mix of components, of 3 components at least, leaking and many other things associated with star formation feedback, post-AGVs at the septal level, or Holmes in general, SOX if you have outflows, and AGN and the dilution of the AGN. So these are the most complex things to say. So in here, I think we still don't have an answer. But this approach, to me, I think is much better than what we are doing now. That is summing everything together and putting one point in here. And that's a total mistake. Okay. I don't know if this answers the question.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and for the answer. Now we have a question from Vazdekis.
Thank you, Sebastián, for such a nice summary. And I think the view you are conveying to us, that, this is like a next step from when we, if you look back in time exactly. So while we are in the IFUs, and then we can go into more detail. I have a comment, and then I will, okay, so, I mean, it's, well, we used to, because we come from a decade ago where we were putting up a point in this BPT diagram, and that's it. Okay, so, and we classify the galaxies accordingly and so on. However, by definition, these are ratio versus ratio. So this means that we can have several contributors, but in the end, one is the dominant one. Okay, which does not necessarily mean that there's no other contributions as well. So and that's why also it's so important to have the IFU in order to go into the details and so on. No, I would like to have like something like this BPT diagram, but if you could add another dimension with the stellar populations there, that would be great. I mean, you have to think maybe the way to do it. So it's just a suggestion. But in any case, you have a plot, because I'm very curious, that you show the gradient of the star formation. Can you, on all kind of galaxies? Yeah, well, yeah. No. Yeah.
This or this?
The specific one. Yes, exactly. Yeah. That one. So connected with what is of my my interest, and I wanted to ask you whether this is, I mean, what extent this is real. But if you look at the ellipticals plot, you see in the very center that is the other way around. I mean, it goes up.
Yeah, in the very center. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is exactly coincides, and given the scale. Yeah, we coincide with our result. I mean, and it's very interesting to see that in the going. I mean, you go down, okay, which is, I mean, basically, if you cut this at let's say 1 effective radius, okay, more or less, the result is absolutely coincident with our findings from the young star population. But then I am so interested, in the gradient that goes up. So it looks to me like whether the innermost part is the, let's say, the fast formation process that led to this residual star formation, and then you have other things, and I don't want to enter the discussion, like probably accretion or merging or whatever that may be related to this going up in that plot. Would you agree with that, or do you have any?
No, I mean, I didn't put a lot. First, I passed. I'm very slow when I present these things because I think I tried to say too many things. But I didn't give at the moment. I didn't give too much credit to this rising up at the moment. The reason is that the resolution effects we have in the center does not allow me to really make a very strong conclusion. the fact that this is coincident with more recent results, and not only you, I mean, I think there was an article by Civetti that also showed it's rising up in the very center, like 1 year or 2 years ago. It's telling me that I quote in the review that maybe there is things that has to be explored here in more detail. But the resolution at the moment, whenever we had the blue muse and a better UV data that can be combined with that, then so from here to 10, 15 years, I don't know, maybe we can even, maybe with the UV combined with muse, we can already say a bit more on that. So yeah, two different events. I think this what is happening here is in the center is a kind of rejuvenation. So there is a new inflow of gas, or maybe it's a remnant of what had happened before. I still don't know. I think that it's in the lines of what you said. What is happening in the outer part is stringing, because the specific star formation rate is very similar. The levels is very similar to what you find in early spirals. And actually, it's not only a question of integrative or average properties you see in individual ones. I have shown one. I didn't put a lot of. If you see this S0 galaxy, this is a classical S0 with a lens. So this is the real lens galaxy in the center, no? And you see these remnants of star formation that are clearly star-forming regions that are not that evident here. If you look better, maybe there are some clumps in here, but in here are evident in the missile lines. And if you plot the equivalent with distribution that is totally correlated with the specific star formation rate, this is drop to 0 in the center, but in the very center you see something that I'm still not sure. But there's a drop and then there is a rising, and that level of rising is similar to what you see in here. No, so if you compare these two galaxies, you see the sequence of quenching from the inside out. So this is the quenching goes and is growing somehow. But what happened in the very, very center, I still don't have an answer. I think your results are coincident with this peak that rise up. And most probably it's true that there are some galaxies where this is happening. But I don't have an answer, a definitive answer. But yes, I think the results agree.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So thanks again, Sebastián, for this very nice presentation. And see you all soon. So, thank you really much.
Okay. See you.